So, the book of Exodus, we're going to jump into the book today. We're going to look at the first few chapters here. I anticipate we'll probably get to about chapter 9 or 10 today. We'll see where we go. And then we'll take breaks roughly about every hour or so. That'll be our agenda. Okay. Now, when we think about the intro to the book of Exodus, this beginning story here, one of the things I think about with Moses is just times in our lives where God has called us to go and do something and we haven't wanted to do it. You know, it's a kind of a fairly common thing that God does in people's lives that he calls, is for them to do something that they don't necessarily want to do. You think of even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he knows that it is his time to go to the cross, and he prays, if there's any way for this cup to pass from me, let's do it. But not my will, but yours be done. You know, we see this with Moses as well, that when he has come to this point of being called by God to the burning bush, encountering Yahweh for the very first time, that he is not ready to follow in the path that God has for him. And in my own life, one of the first outreaches I led when I was first staffing DTS was to a nation that I did not want to go to. I was called, the one thing that I didn't want to do was go to China on my outreach. And that was the one place that the leaders had felt that I should lead a team to. And I was like, okay, you got to be careful when you tell God no. Like, I'll go anywhere except here, because that probably is where God will send you. Just speaking from a lot of experience. But that outreach was one of the most impactful early moments in my Christian walk. It was the first time I was able to lead somebody to the Lord and share the gospel with somebody, to see somebody's life change, to be able to be humbled and grow. And there were so many things the Lord did on that outreach that would not have happened if I had just continued to say no and had not gone based out of my own flesh. And one of the things that we learn from the story of Moses here and from the early chapters is that our flesh should not be the primary dictator of our obedience, and we must be wary of our flesh when it comes to the call of God on our lives. Because oftentimes the first response is not, yes, that sounds amazing. Most of the time our first response is, oh no, I really don't want to do that. Because that's what we see. I mean, throughout the Bible, there's very rarely somebody whose first response is absolutely, I'm ready to go, right? And, I mean, even Ananias, who's called to go and pray for Paul for his healing, right? Even he's like, I don't know about this guy. Like, he's a bad guy, so I'm not really ready to go. Peter, as well, would have been a little hesitant to go with Cornelius' servants if he hadn't had that vision. And so we see kind of this similar theme. Now, when we'll see that as we get into Moses here at the beginning. But chapter 1, when we look at the book of Exodus, can we have someone read verses 8 through 10 nice and loud for us? Okay, so the opening verse of the opening words of Pharaoh in the narrative here of chapter 1 points towards the fact that they probably had just recently driven out the Hyksos people, or in some recent time, because they say, let us deal shrewdly with them so they do not join our enemies. Right now, if the Hyksos come from a similar ethnic background as the Hebrews, then probably that would be the enemies that they're anticipating that they could possibly join. So when they enslave them, then they have them build two cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now, as we mentioned yesterday, this is one of the things that kind of skews people's perspective or bends it more towards being a later date, because at the time of Thutmose III, there is no Pithom and Ramses. And as far as we can tell in ancient Egyptian geography, there is no city named Pithom. And Ramses comes at a much later date in the 13th century, the 1200s BC. But what are they building in these places? It says they're building the storehouses, right, of these cities, or the store cities. And that they're probably building not like construction of apartments or government buildings or things like that, but storehouses. And the location that we're looking at for these places, as we talked about the name change yesterday to a later name for Ramses, the name Pithom means the temple of the god Atum, or the house of Atum, which is probably what is being referred to here, which is one of the places that Thutmose III was building, the house of Atum in his reign. Now, where is that located at today? Okay, the location that has been most likely determined as the place for the house of Atum geographically is the city, modern city of Heliopolis. And if you guys aren't aware, that's where you are right now, is the city of Heliopolis, which means the city of the sun. Okay? Now, so sense, Heli, sun, Ra, house of Ra, this is the same location. That is the likely location. So the city of P. Ramses then was another store city that was being built at the time of Thutmose III. One of the things that's important to know about the slave labor force in the Egyptian world is that Egyptians prized their architecture and their building projects so much they did not allow slaves to build their buildings. They only allowed Egyptians to build their buildings. So people suggest that, were the pyramids built by a slave labor force? Probably not, because the Egyptians did not trust outside people to construct their buildings, even under the oversight of Egyptians. So what was the slave labor force primarily doing? They were primarily transporting bricks and making bricks, which is exactly what we see the Israelites doing. The Israelites are not tasked with building anything. The Israelites are tasked with making bricks. And so when all the straw is taken away, they're still forced to make bricks. And that's their primary job, is just making mud bricks for buildings. So but they're not constructing them. Yeah. Yeah, so they're building the materials, but they're not assembling the buildings. Yeah. And we know this because of the depictions that we see of other slave labor forces that are just building bricks or transporting building materials to the locations where then Egyptians are building them. If you look on the first slide of today, which I think is slide number 30, what you'll see is Egyptians building and constructing here. So they're taking the building materials and they're actually constructing the buildings. And the way that we're able to distinctly tell people in paintings the difference between them is because of the way that they are painted. It's very easy to tell the difference between cultures based on what they wore, based on their facial structure, even depicted in ancient tomb paintings or temple paintings. Now, as the story goes along, of course, the Egyptians see the growth of the Israelites and ask the midwives then to have all the baby boys who are born cast into the Nile or to be killed. And what the midwives demonstrate here for the original readers is a fear of the Lord over the fear of man. That over the instructions of Pharaoh, that they would rather trust in the Lord their God, even with the little knowledge that they have of God. Right? They don't know very much, but they do know that this is wrong. Right? And that they are more willing to find a way to deal shrewdly with Pharaoh than they are to compromise that moral value system that they recognize is wrong. And I think it's an important lesson for anybody that despite what they might face, persecution or difficulty, that their circumstances are not dictating their obedience to God, but they're faithful to what they know of who God is, even in their limited knowledge. Just one quick note on the building of bricks and use of slave labor. There was a official during the time of Thutmose III. His name is Vizier Rechem, and his tomb was discovered within the past 100 years. and he was a overseer of slave labor force in the 1460s BC, as far as is able to be told, which is about 16 years before the Exodus. And he was also overseeing an Asiatic people group that were building bricks for temples, or making bricks to be used to build temples. Now, this is much farther down the Nile River and is not depicting the Israelite people, but a similar situation that kind of attests to the likelihood of the same thing happening in this region, near the Nile River Delta, or in the part of Lower Egypt. So with the Hebrew babies then being preserved, Moses is one of those babies. Okay, so he's born, he's seen to be beautiful, and his mother wants to save his life. Instead of throwing him in the Nile River, she puts him inside of a basket that is kind of lined with pitch and bitumen, so that it will not sink in the Nile River, but he'll be able to float. So she waterproofs it, she puts the baby in the Nile River, and sends him down the river. The interesting thing with the situation is that in this chapter, Moses is going to escape death twice. And the first time that he escapes death is in this little basket that's also called an ark. So the same word that's used in Hebrew for Noah's basket is the same word that's used for Noah's ark in Genesis, chapters 8 through 9. And so the similar kind of idea is meant to be presented, that God is saving a deliverer through this kind of water craft for a future destiny for his people. And so God's hand is on it. That should be seen the similar way, that God is saving him the same way that he had saved Noah and his family. And so Moses is drawn out of the water, which is what his name means. His name means drawn out, and it is an Egyptian name, but it speaks to his prophetic destiny. Right? Because he is going to be the one who draws Israel out of Egypt. And the fact that he has an Egyptian name is not surprising. Chapter 6, a lot of the names that are listed there are just holdovers from Egyptian culture as well. And so what that just demonstrates is that there was a strong assimilation into Egyptian culture for the Israelite people, because they're adopting the names of the culture that they're in. What we see with ancient Near Eastern cultures is that as they want to preserve their culture wherever they live, they tend to maintain the names of their historical families. And so what you would expect is a lot of names that have El in them or Yah in them. So Elijah, Elisha are examples of this, have Yah in both of their names. And so you'd expect something along those lines. But most of the names there are Egyptian names, just showing the assimilation into their lives. So Moses is brought into the home of Pharaoh, where he lives his life after he has been weaned by his family, or by his mother. And as he grows up in the house of Pharaoh, Acts tells us that he was raised in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. Right? Acts chapter 7, verse 22, that he was powerful in word and deed, and he was raised inside of this household as a person who is probably being prepared for some kind of political or official activity, okay? Because he's being trained in all of these things. Now, what God is really doing is he's getting Moses ready to lead the nation, right? For Moses to be in the household of Pharaoh for this period of time gets him ready to eventually take over leadership for the nation of Israel. He would have learned to read, to write, to lead with authority, to organize a nation, and to run things effectively. And then one day he's out surveying the property of Pharaoh, the slaves, the slave labor force. And I imagine it very much something like if you guys have seen the Exodus movie with Christian Bale. He's out just looking, right? He's seen as this kind of like royal official, part of Pharaoh's household, and he's observing the labor force and what they're doing, how they're constructing things. And in the process of that, he sees an Egyptian beating an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, right? He ends up killing the Egyptian, and then the next day comes out and sees two Hebrews fighting and breaks them up, and they have seen what he thought nobody had seen, him killing the Egyptian. From there, he's forced to leave. Now, some people will ask, if he's part of Pharaoh's household, then why would he be forced to leave if he kills an Egyptian like that? Shouldn't he be protected because of his royal status? And it's likely that because he may be inside of the household of Pharaoh, but ethnically he is not Egyptian. Right? To us, it would be just as much like being a white person in an Egyptian home as it would be being a Hebrew in an Egyptian home. Okay, we might think, oh, there's similar skin tone, there's similar facial structure, but ethnically they are worlds apart. Okay, even though they might be a little similar in skin tone or facial structure. Okay, they're very, very different people. Back in the ancient world, people were much more protective of their ethnic identities than people tend to be in our modern world today. And there's a lot of examples of this. But anyways, so Moses then has to flee away from the land of Egypt. Now, what was Moses doing? Was Moses just trying to protect a Hebrew that he identified with? Is this kind of an identity crisis for him? He's been raised in the household of Pharaoh. I'll get your question in just a minute. He's been raised in the household of Pharaoh. Is he identifying as an Egyptian, but now he's seeing a Hebrew being beaten? And is he kind of struggling with his own identity of being a Hebrew or being an Egyptian? Right? I think that's a possibility here. But the book of Acts chapter 7, verse 25 will tell us that he was trying to deliver the people already. So it seems like maybe he's attempting to step into that calling or that expectation of destiny of him as a deliverer. And in the book of Acts, Stephen says that the people of Israel did not recognize Moses as their deliverer at that point. They kind of reject him because the next day they say, oh, you killed an Egyptian, are you going to kill us too? So we kind of maybe get this thought, maybe Moses is leaning more towards that idea, or it could just be this identity piece. But anyways, he flees to the land of Midian. Hannah, what's the question?
Yeah, kind of going back to his identity, how would you have known that he was Hebrew? Do you think Pharaoh's daughter told him like the story about saving him and he just knew he looked different?
Probably could just look in a mirror.
Okay.
Yeah. They wouldn't have had mirrors like we do, but they would have polished silver, which does give a good reflection. Yeah. So the way he looks would have been different.
So you knew Pharaoh wasn't actually.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, easily. Yeah. Just the way he looks, he could tell that. Yeah. Yeah.
So when it says like, so his mom nursed him like his real mom.
Yes.
Until he grew older. So then would she have like taught him like if he had been at the age where he would understand like all the Hebrew culture, like because I feel like if he's growing up in Pharaoh's house, that he really feels like affected by the Egyptian their gods and stuff. How does he know like that the God of Israel is his?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some thoughts on how. Either it could have been that he was weaned into a late or a mid-childhood, so weaning could go all the way until 5 years old, potentially. So he could have been cared for, nursed in the family home until as late as 5 years old, but probably somewhere between 3 and 4. And he could have been taught things at that time. I mean, my son is 3.5 almost, and what he's learning right now is amazing. I mean, just the taking in of information, what he could learn. So potentially he could take in a lot, but I do think that he is primarily influenced by the Egyptian environment around him. And so how did he come to know all of this stuff about Yahweh and the history of Abraham and his family? I think we'll see that in Midian in just a moment. Do you have a comment you're thinking about?
I was like, what would Pharaoh's daughter have thought? Like when she sees this baby, she's like, well, obviously it's Hebrew. Is that what she thinks, or she's like, oh, it's just something? Like, that isn't really weird for her, then like, it's obviously Hebrew, but I'll take it this way.
Yeah, one thing that we want to be careful to do is just impose the view of Pharaoh upon every Egyptian. That all the Egyptians just suddenly hate the Hebrews for whatever random reason because Pharaoh's like, kill the baby boys, right? So we don't know what's going on in her heart. Maybe she is like compassionate. Says, I want to save this baby. He doesn't deserve to be sent down the Nile River like this. We do know he was an incredibly beautiful baby, and so she might have picked him up and been like, this baby needs to live and not die, and just wants to take care of him. And then Moses' sister, right, Miriam, is there, and says, "Oh, we can take care of him and nurse him for you, and then bring him back to you." Right. So she followed the basket down the river. The one thing just to know is that Pharaoh's daughter would not have been oblivious to things like this. Okay, exposing of children and abortions in the ancient world are well attested to. Abortion is not anything new. It's been going on for over 4,000 years, and there has been a variety of ways to do it throughout history. The Romans were some of the best at it. And exposing of children was a very common practice in the ancient world for children that were unwanted. There are well attested to in major cities baby graveyards, where if you didn't want a baby, you would just go out and put it with all the rest of the dead babies, and then the animals would come and pick it alive, or pick it until it's dead. And so that kind of practice goes on in the ancient world. So the idea of sending a baby down the Nile River or throwing a baby in the Nile River, while it seems abominable to us, isn't something that's too far-fetched in the ancient world.
Or was this like Pharaoh's daughter who then found this baby? Like, it didn't say that she was married or if there was multiple daughters. Like, I'm just wondering how like high up Moses' status actually would have been. Also, was he like one of the thousands of Pharaoh's grandparents?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it wasn't like a small family home, like 5 people in a house. Like, it would have been a royal complex type idea. And while Pharaoh seems to just have one wife at a time, there would be a harem or a number of concubines, and so there would have been a lot of offspring being produced. And Pharaoh's daughter, it's just like unclear. It's not like they're sitting down at a family meal every night with the 10 of them around a table, and then suddenly a baby shows up, and where'd that baby come from, right? It's like a royal temple complex, the royal palace complex. And so who knows how often he would have seen him or how much he would have been aware of him and things like that. It's just really unclear.
So there's also like a standard of education that they all learn.
Yeah, inside of the household. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So sure, yeah, I'll repeat the question. Sorry about that. I realize when everybody's talking to me, I can hear all of you. But yeah, when you're talking behind somebody, it's a little hard. So yes, I'll repeat the questions. So Moses flees the land of Midian, and when he flees the land of Midian, he finds these women, he protects them, he waters their flocks, and then they come to their father-in-law Jethro. And did anybody notice the description of what it says about Jethro there? It calls him the priest of Midian, right? Well, what kind of priest is he, and what kind of God are they worshiping in Midian? Okay. Well, one thing that's important to recognize is that the Midianites come from Abraham. If you go back to Genesis chapter 25, Abraham, after Sarah dies, takes a wife named Keturah, and he produces a number of children with Keturah, one of them being Midian. And the Midianites come from the descendancy of Abraham. And so it is likely that they carry on the traditions of Abraham. They obviously practice circumcision, which is why Zipporah knows how to circumcise her son. So it seems like they're carrying on some kind of aspect of the covenant that had been given to Abraham. Okay? So being a priest is not just someone who functions in a ritual setting. A priest is the carrier of the story and the tradition and the family history. They are the primary ones who are meant to pass on the instructions that have been given to the family and the traditional stories that have been associated with their fathers and mothers throughout their past. And so it's likely that Jethro could have been the one that influenced Moses a lot in his understanding of who Yahweh was and what Abraham had done and the family history of Abraham and his other offspring potentially. So that could be what's going on with Moses knowing more about him and not really being surprised at who Yahweh is and knowing the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That might be where it comes from as well, just given our understanding. Okay. So when it says then near the end of chapter 2 that God heard the cries of the people and he remembered his covenant with them. Now, some people will maybe ask the question, did God forget? Right? Did he forget, and that's why he remembered? But the verb remember often appears with some kind of activity, and it's not necessarily that something was forgotten, but that a memory is prompted and leads to a specific action. So it's not a forgetfulness of something, but it's a calling to mind that something, it's the timeliness of something. So God takes notice of this then, and he will respond accordingly. And that idea of taking notice, again, carries this empathy for the people and identification with the people. And he will bring to fulfillment the words that he had spoken to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. That now it is time to bring the people out of Egypt. But why did God wait so long? Why did he wait so long? And with Moses, why was he waiting 80 years? When Moses is 40 years old, he's going, and seems like you can interpret it as he's going to begin to deliver the people, and they reject him. Right? It's 40 more years before Moses is going to come and lead the people out of slavery. So why? Why is this taking so long? Why is it not happening sooner? Well, I think a lot of it is God preparing Moses. Right? The responsibility that Moses has is arguably the most important in the entire Bible next to Jesus. Okay? Nobody does more miracles in the Bible than Jesus except Moses than Jesus. Okay? He does the most miracles after Jesus. His role is the most significant in setting up the law, in organizing the people, organizing the religious system, getting them ready to enter the promised land, and setting them up as a nation as they go into the promised land. Right? Moses' role in giving them the history from Genesis through Deuteronomy is arguably the most important thing that any single figure will do for Israel except for Jesus. And so it is no surprise that God takes a long period of time to prepare him for the role that he's going to take. And we see this in the 40 years that he spends in the household of Pharaoh. Right? Learning government, learning linguistics, writing, language, all of the things that would be necessary to run a nation. And then what many will say is his 40 years in the wilderness shepherding, which the shepherding idea will be consistent with people like David, Abraham, Jesus calling himself the Good Shepherd, all of the leaders of Israel in the time of the prophets being referred to as shepherds. Okay? So this whole idea is taking care of the people. Right, looking after them, making sure that they're taken care of, and growing really his humility. Having been somebody who is the top of society in the household of Pharaoh and now has been humbled to live in the desert for 40 years. He's as well learning survival in the wilderness. All of the places that he goes as a shepherd are the places that he will eventually take the children of Israel through the wilderness. And so he's learning how to survive. He's becoming familiar with the locations that they are going to spend 40 years in the desert at. Yes?
Is that a time for the live that long at that period in time? 8 years, just getting started. So
Yeah.
Was that 120 years? Isn't that like that?
Yeah. Another 40 years with Israel after their exodus. Yeah. We do see long lifespans with the patriarchs throughout the period, and so, yeah, I think it's lending itself to the longer lifespan of people. Egypt attests to this in their writings as well, that people are living into their hundreds, 110, 120, and it's recorded in their chronologies. So I don't think it's too far-fetched to think. One thing that is important to be aware of is that Hebrew numbers are probably rounded to the closest tens, because rarely will you see years or ages that are going to be different, that are not going to end in a zero. Okay, so 110, 120, 100, 80, 40. And so what we don't think it's actually like 40 years on his birthday type thing, right? It's like maybe he's 39, maybe he's 41. We're not really sure exactly how old he is because the Hebrew like writing style more rounds those numbers out. So were they in Egypt for 430 years to the day? Maybe not, right? Could be right around there. Was it 480 years exactly when they came out of Egypt? Give or take a couple years, maybe. That's why we're all using like kind of circa for all these dates, is because it's not really like exactly on that point. So just to be aware, Hebrew years are probably rounded, which is why they're all even. Yeah. Okay. So with Moses then, he's being prepared for the ministry that God has for him. And one of, I think, the questions that this provokes for us is, are we trusting the Lord for his timing in our lives? So often we want to just rush into whatever we feel God calling us to right away, right? If he gives us a word, it's like, let's do it tomorrow, And God is not always ready to do that with us, right? Sometimes he needs to take time to prepare us. And we often neglect or despise periods of preparation. To the Israelites after the exile, the prophets speak and they say, don't despise the day of small beginnings, right? Well, none of us, I think, are despising the day of small beginnings, but some of us are despising the periods of preparation, right? To think, man, how, 20 years old, I'm ready to go into what God has called me to. I'm not ready to take 7 years to prepare myself for what God is asking of me, right? But are we willing to take the periods of time to prepare ourselves for the ministry that God is calling us into to be able to serve well? What we see with people like Moses, like David, Jesus, Paul, is they all spent long periods of time, even decades, getting ready for the call of God in their life. And oftentimes, the longer they spent in periods of preparation, the more significant their impact for God's kingdom was. And so we should not despise periods where God is getting us ready to get training, to build our understanding, to gain skills, to learn certain professions, to be able to contribute to and to do what God has called us to well, is so, so important, because that's what we see in the Bible. We're ready to step right into something. And we often will hold this perspective of, well, Peter and John were uneducated, ordinary men, right? Book of Acts. And that doesn't mean they didn't learn. That just means they didn't have formal rabbinic training. Right? They were trained by Jesus for 3 years. Okay? And when you look at them, okay, how much of an impact does Peter and John have compared to Paul? Right? It's not really comparable. I mean, Paul never even walked face-to-face with Jesus, and he has more of an impact on early church history and the planting and expansion of the early church than probably Peter and John combined. And he spent decades studying as a Jew under the feet of Gamaliel, and then he went for 3 years into Arabia, and then he spent probably 10 years in Tarsus before he ever started his ministry. And we're like, I'm ready to go tomorrow, God takes people through periods of preparation, and we have to be ready to go into that. Part of my own story fits in with this as well, is that I had always wanted to teach. It's just been something that kind of my family has done. My mom and dad were both teachers in various capacities. My sisters had taught, and my desire had been to teach even before I got saved. And then when I had gotten saved, I really wanted to start teaching the Bible. As I began reading it and understanding it, I wanted to tell people about it, to help them understand it. And in my first 5 years in YWAM, I had 10 hours accumulatively in 5 years. So roughly about 2 hours a year to be able to teach in various capacities, which is hardly anything. After doing SBS, and Titus Project, the year that I had done that, the Lord opened the door for more teaching and had 100 hours of teaching in that 1 year. So it had multiplied 10 times over in just the matter of about 8 months after my SBS. And from there had continued kind of consistently in that. But the more that I had gotten training, and the more that I had studied, and the more that I had devoted myself to learning more about the Bible, I saw the Lord opening more and more doors. To when I had moved to Cambridge with Miji to help them pioneer their SBS there. At that time, I had never had an invitation to speak internationally anywhere before. But in that 1 year, 16 invitations in 1 year from nothing. And it was one thing where I felt the Lord say, I'm going to open the door for teaching. I'm like, I don't know how, because I know nobody. And he just brought all of these invitations that I had no idea where they were coming from. And what I don't use the story to boast myself, but to illustrate the point of saying that we have got to trust God for his timing, because he really knows the best, right? And with Moses, we see him maybe kind of trying to push the door down, let's do this deliverance thing right now. Or with Abraham, God says you're going to have as many descendants as the stars in the sky, and it's not really happening. And so he says, okay, well, Sarah's like, what about Hagar? You could have an heir with Hagar, and we could get this thing going a little bit. And he does it, and then God doesn't show up for 10 years, right? 10 years. He thinks Ishmael is his promised descendant, and then God shows up and he says, nope, I'll give you one from Sarah, right? And we see him even trying to push the door, all right, let's do this thing, instead of trusting God for his timing. And I think it's just an important lesson we see from people like this, that we have got to trust in the Lord for his timing, and to know that periods of preparation are essential for stepping into ministry that God has for us. All right, so let's look at the burning bush passage here, and then we will take a break. Yes?
I think you said this, but when it says the shepherds came, are those the
In which
Bethel's brothers?
this is probably the shepherds of Midian.
Oh, so not
Yeah, these are
the
Midianites.
shepherds, but
Yeah.
I-
So so that's how the Egyptians referred to them.
okay,
Yeah.
they were
Yeah, but because it's in the context of the Midianites, it's probably Midianite shepherds.
just quick. So he was in Egypt for
40 years.
40,
Yeah.
and then in the wilderness, or Midian for
About 40 years.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and then leading the people of Israel for about 40 years. Yeah. All right, so we look at chapter 3, the burning bush passage, and one day Moses is out tending his flocks, and he sees a bush that's on fire. Now, I think the funny thing to me is he sees the bush and he's not really taken aback. He's like, oh, there's a bush on fire over there, no big deal. And it says when he saw the bush was not being consumed. So it's like, he looks over, he's like, oh, it's on fire. A couple minutes later, it's still on fire. Looks again, it's like, well, it's not burning up. Let's go see what's going on here. And when he walks over to the bush, that's when he hears God say, take your sandals off. And the moment in chapter 3, verse 5, where God says that you are on holy ground, is a very, very important moment, because it is the first usage of the word holy in the Bible. And this first usage of the word holy is connected with Yahweh. Okay? And the basic standard and understanding of holiness for God's people will be set by him. Okay? Him being the standard of all holiness, and him being the perfect picture of holiness. And so Moses is called to come, take his sandals off, because he's on holy ground. And what God begins to say to Moses is that he hears the cry of his people. God doesn't start with, I'm going to fulfill my promises. He doesn't start with a task. He starts with the people. And what we'll see here, and then in chapter 4 as well, is that God's heart is for Israel as his firstborn son. As a people, he cares for them. He hears their suffering and responds to their cry. Right? He's not just task-oriented. All right, time's up. Let's go take the promised land. Right? He hears the people. Yeah.
I have a question to the firstborn son. Isn't there also a passage in the New Testament where Jesus is like the firstborn son of Israel? So why does God refer to Israel as the firstborn?
Yeah, so Israel is... let's talk about... Can you ask that question again when we're talking about chapter 4? Okay. This will fit better in there. Okay. And I'll repeat the question when we do it. All right. So the process then moves into recounting of the promises. Okay, or the process moves into recounting of the promises. Right after he says, I hear their cry, then he moves into saying, now I'm going to fulfill my promises for them as a people. And so God is reminding Moses of what he has spoken before, his character. This takes him again right back to Genesis 15 and his faithfulness. Okay, so this is a good time to talk about Genesis 15. Did you guys talk about that in the Bible overview at all, or the Old Testament overview? Genesis 15 is one of the most essential passages in the Pentateuch for what is going on. Because in that passage, right, Abraham is kind of doubting that God is going to give him a descendant, and he's questioning, all of my inheritance is going to go to Eliezer of Damascus, and he's going to receive all of the wealth of my house. And God takes Abraham out under the stars, and he says, look at the stars in the sky, and your descendants will be as many as the stars. And then Abraham believes, and it says that his faith is counted to him as righteousness. And he responds again by saying, well, how will I know? How will I know that that is going to happen? And then God gives him some weird instructions, right? Take a bunch of animals and cut them in half, right? Cut them right down the middle. And this is a pretty common ritual of the ancient world. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but basically what you would do is you go to a place, you would dig a small trench, usually a couple inches deep, and then you'd cut the animals and you spread them out across the trench, and all of their blood and guts would come into the trench. And so it would just be very bloody and like bloody mud in the dirt. Okay? And then what you would do is with the person that you're making the agreement with is you would both walk through together. And sometimes they would walk through in a figure 8 around it, which is kind of this sign for infinity, around the animals through the blood twice. And it was a symbol of our covenant agreement is to death. That if one of us would break this covenant, let happen to me what has happened to these animals. Let me be killed if I break this covenant. Okay. So what is unique about that scenario then? Abraham gets the animals, he digs the trench, cuts them in half, and then what happens to Abraham? He falls asleep, right? He falls asleep, and then he has a vision, right? And in the vision, what does he see? A flaming torch and a smoking pot that pass through the animals together. So there's still two parties, but what do those represent? What else presents itself as a flame and smoke? God, right? So what God is saying is he is making a covenant with himself, right? And we know that God cannot be unfaithful to himself. And so he makes this covenant with himself that I will bring the people out of slavery. And you can guarantee that you will receive this land because I cannot be unfaithful to myself. So that covenant is made, and that's what God is bringing up here, is that the people are going to be brought out of Egypt and brought into the land because God cannot be unfaithful to himself. And so God commissions Moses to go and set the people free. And just like, a good Christian, Moses asks for confirmation, right? He says, give me a sign of confirmation that this will happen. And what does God say in verse 12? Chapter 3, verse 12 of Exodus. What's the confirmation God gives to Moses? Yeah. That's not a very heartwarming sign of confirmation, is it? You will know that it was me calling you when you come back to the mountain. Once you've accomplished everything I've sent you to do, then you will know that it was me. Right? That's not a very confirming confirmation. For us, it's like, it doesn't give me a lot of peace that I'm supposed to do this. It's only once you've accomplished it, then you know it was God. And I think that a great lesson to learn from this with God is that we don't always need him to affirm something ahead of time to know that it's him. Sometimes the confirmation comes in the accomplishment of what God is calling us to. And once it has happened, then we know that was God. Right? That's a pretty big, it's a pretty big statement for God to make. Right? Go free the people from Egypt. Take an entire nation out of the most powerful nation in the world at the time, and then you will know that it's me. So God gives him that sign, and Moses has to trust him. He's got to trust him for that fulfillment, because that's not something he can do on his own. Getting the nation out there, that's not something that he can accomplish by himself. And we will see that happening in chapters 5 and 6, very specifically, before the signs start to happen in chapter 7. So Moses says, "Who shall I say sent me?" And the self-revelation of God here, where he says, "I am," is a way, the response is a way of revealing a new aspect of God's character or understanding of the relationship between Israel and their God. Okay? Saying, "Who shall I say sent me?" is a way of requesting, well, what new thing are you revealing about yourself? And this will become the covenant name of God for all of Israel's history henceforth, is Yahweh. That he is a relational God. And this phrase, "I am," or in chapter 20, where he'll say, "I am Yahweh your God," or "I am the Lord your God," it will be an expansion. So there's about 3 or 4 times in this book alone where God will develop this phrase. Okay, so here we get it as simply saying, "I am who I am." And you're like, well, that doesn't tell me very much. Okay, in Hebrew writing, the whole book must be taken into consideration, not each passage. Okay, we can tend to read a book of the Bible like we read a newspaper, and like the book of the Bible is just a bunch of newspaper articles written by different editors, right, or different authors, and then they're just put together into one newspaper by an editor. Okay, you have to read it progressively. They're not trying to give you everything the first time you see something, but you're supposed to take all of the passages about God and let it expand upon the first time he speaks. Okay? So chapter 20, when God is talking about himself in the 10 Commandments. Chapter 19, where he talks about them being born on eagle's wings. Chapter 34, where he's revealing himself to Moses on Mount Sinai. All of those passages are meant to contribute to Exodus chapter 3, where God first reveals himself as Yahweh. Okay? So just an important principle for us is that we should not expect all of the revelation at once. That it will often come progressively as we study a book. Okay. All right, but in the passage, God is going to repeat his relationship with the prior generations of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of the ancestors that they had followed and that he had given promises to. So while he's revealing himself as a name that they have never known before, he is also revealing himself as the covenant-making God that had given promises to their forefathers, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, so before we start chapter 4, are there any questions? Yes.
So, this is the first time that God ever names himself, so they didn't know the name in Genesis.
They call him by a variety of names. So God Almighty, El Shaddai, is the way they refer to him oftentimes. And we'll talk about that name in chapter 6. Because in chapter 6 it explicitly says, I am the Lord, chapter 6 verse 2, "I am the Lord, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, Yahweh, or the Lord, I did not make myself known to them." So he reveals himself as God Almighty, El Shaddai. And then we see a variety of different names of God in the book of Genesis. The God who provides. When Isaac is going to be led to be sacrificed, God said, Abraham calls him the God who provides because he gives a ram in place of Isaac. Or when Hagar is at the well and she cries out to God, and she calls him the God who sees. And so these kind of names of God, a lot of them come up in Genesis because God has not revealed himself as Yahweh yet. So they call him the God who blank because of their experiences with him.
But the divine name is used in Genesis, right? But that's
Yes.
because Moses is writing, or
Yeah.
whoever is writing it after the fact.
Yes. Yeah. So the writing of Genesis probably takes place after the burning bush moment, not before that time. Yeah. Yeah, Joseph. Yeah, the context of the words "I am," it sounds like the name Yahweh. It sounds like Yahweh, and so that "I am," it is this idea of eternal presence, relationship. It encapsulates the ideas of faithfulness. And so to simply say, I am, carries the idea of relationship with the people supremely, that he is with them, he is always existent alongside of them, and he's going to reveal himself as present with them, right? Eternal existence, always present. Kind of this omnipresent, omniscient idea being presented in the I am statement. So the I am is, the Hebrew word is Aya, and I am who I am. It is where we get the tetragrammaton, YHWH, which is unpronounceable, and no vowels are given to it in the Hebrew because it is not meant to be said. So the way we pronounce it in English is Yahweh, but we don't know if that was the way it was pronounced because it was never pronounced. So we translate it as Lord, capital Lord, which is often either translated as Jehovah or Adonai, which is where those other names come from. Yeah. All right. So we'll look at chapter 4 and probably get through up to maybe chapter 7 or so before we take another break. And we'll take a break probably in about an hour or so. All right. So chapter 4, Moses is still at Mount Sinai having this conversation with God about him being sent. And we see Moses' desire to get out of the situation, right? If there's any other way, like anybody else you can send, it's not I don't want to do it, I'm not ready for this. And I think what we see with Moses is that there's a number of things we see with him of his doubt in himself, despite God having called him, but also there is probably an aspect of his comfort that has come in, right? He is comfortable where he's at. He doesn't want to leave what he's doing, and he probably got stuck, And that is important, I think, for us to not get too comfortable in the places we're at that we couldn't hear the call of God. At various times in my own life and in seeing kind of reflection of here where I haven't wanted to go, Meej and I, when we were pretty much settled and planted in Kona, and really involved in a large number of things, getting started a few different ministries on the base, the Lord called us to Cambridge in like one weekend. In a matter of hours, we had prayed and felt like God was saying, go to Cambridge, and we bought our tickets the next day, and within that week we had sold everything that we had and moved to Cambridge a couple months later. And it was definitely taking us out of our comfort zone to do something like that. But Miji and I have been so ready to go in our lives that the Lord has had to work in us to get us to stay somewhere. And it has taken years for us to accept God's calling on us to stay in Kona, to see it as home. And so really that kind of like acceptance of God's call in both respects of always being willing and ready to follow the word of the Lord, whether that is to go or whether it is to stay, but to trust that God has the best in mind, I think is the most important lesson to learn from this. Is not that just to be ready to go, but are we ready to follow the word of the Lord, even if it is to stay somewhere that we may not have desired to stay initially, to make that place home. So Moses is called by God to go, and he's given a number of signs, right? The staff into a snake, leprous hand, turning water to blood, and all of these things are going to be things that we will see come up in Exodus, but also the Pentateuch. We see that leprosy deal coming up in the book of Numbers. And Moses has this phrase repeated 4 times in this section to him, that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And to Moses, this, I think, would be a real affirmation. And for the OR that Moses is writing this book for, to see that God is the God of their fathers. He's faithful to what he has spoken. That's a consistent, ringing truth. One of the things to pay attention to in Old Testament is repetition. Okay? When you see things repeated, they are very important because ancient writers don't mince their words. Okay? They are not just writing to fill space. It's not like you when you're writing a high school paper, trying to look up all the synonyms and all the extra words so you can fill in your word count, right? Moses does not have a ton of paper. He does not have a ton of ink, or maybe it's clay tablets. Who knows what it was originally written on? And the ability to write, the costliness of writing, the time-consuming nature of writing, all play a factor. So when something is repeated, it's incredibly important. Now, when something is repeated 4 times, you can bet that is very, very significant, right? You're not going to waste space by saying, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's a long phrase to repeat 4 times in only a very narrow portion of Scripture. So when you see repetition like that, it should instantly provoke you as a Bible student to say, why? Why is this repeated so much? What is trying to be communicated through this repetition? When you read Leviticus on Friday evening and you see the word holy repeated about 80 times in 27 chapters, you should really think about holiness, right? You really should think about why is this repeated so much, okay? So repetition, I cannot emphasize it enough. It is incredibly important for you as a Bible student to pay attention to and to ask good questions about. Okay. So Moses goes out from there, right? He asks for Aaron, his brother, to come to him. God gets angry with Moses, but sends Aaron to meet him, and Moses and Aaron meet each other, and then they will head back. Now we get this language of firstborn that was asked about in chapter 4, verse 22, where God will say, "Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son." Okay, so the language of firstborn has a lot to do with inheritance in the patriarchal period. So this is why, like why Ishmael is kicked out of the house, is because he's technically the oldest, and he would receive the inheritance from Abraham. And with Jacob and Esau, why Esau then, even though he barely came out first, he's still the firstborn of the twins, and he's the rightful recipient of the inheritance. When you have Ephraim and Manasseh, and Joseph switches his hands to bless the younger instead of the older, then it is the emphasis of that idea of inheritance. And so the firstborn son language for the people at the time is the one who will inherit the household, the one who will be the representative of the patriarch. And so Israel is seen as God's representative. Okay, one of the things that we really must pay attention to, be aware of for the whole Old Testament, is that God's choice of Israel is not for salvation. Okay, God didn't choose them to give them a special salvation. God chose them to be his representatives. So his choice is not for salvation, but representation. Okay? That's really important for us, because we can kind of elevate this people group to say they are guaranteed a spot in heaven, in God's kingdom, to be in his presence. And when you read the Gospels, especially the Gospel of John, it is very clear that is not how it happens in the kingdom of God. John chapter 1 opens up and it says, it's not by blood, it's not by flesh, not by the will of a man that someone is included in God's kingdom. It's by their faith in Jesus Christ. Okay? But because of God's choice, the Israelites, the Jews, had developed this belief about themselves that they were going to be the essence of God's kingdom because of his choice of them. But they're chosen for representation. And so that kind of firstborn language carries that idea with it. So Jesus then, as the firstborn of all of creation, that kind of language, is not language of Jesus being born, because this language is talking about his preeminence before his incarnation, right? And so Jesus is not born in that sense pre-incarnation, right? He is born into a physical body, like the book of Philippians tells us, him taking on flesh and humbling himself. But Jesus' position as firstborn is a position of title, not of physical birth, right? So he was uncreated, and then he took on flesh and became man. So that's that kind of idea. Yeah. Does that help bring that all together? Okay. Yeah, Joseph.
Yeah, you kind of answered the question.
Okay.
I'm asking, just to clarify, so that was, so God was using that language of about them representing God.
Yes. So his question is, was the firstborn language for the purpose of showing who they were to represent? And I think so, yes. Because the Deuteronomy passage we highlighted yesterday, Deuteronomy 34, I think verse 8, or 32, verse 8, 9, where it says, "But the Lord's portion is his people, and Jacob is his allotted inheritance." So there's a lot of ways that God refers to his relationship with Israel. Whether that is father to son, whether later on it will be husband to bride, or covenant king to covenant vassal. There's a lot of language that's used variably. There was one more question over here. So. Yes.
So, Israel was chosen not just for salvation. So we can understand that the Midianites, they also are saved. Because they also can be saved, but because they're believing in God, and all that, like the priest,
Yeah.
So, but Israel was just like the representation of the God.
Yes. So let me ask a question. How does someone get saved? You're a missionary, right? How do they get saved? How do they get saved? How does someone get saved?
Like, I think for forgiveness, repentance, and believing in God.
Yeah, repentance and putting your faith in Jesus Christ. Right? That's what Jesus says. Right? Put your faith in me, right, and receive eternal life. So, has that changed? No. How was Abraham counted righteous? By his faith, before the law. Paul's whole argument about salvation is to go back to Abraham and to say God has done it the same way from the very beginning. It's always been by faith. So, could the Midianites put their faith in God and be saved? Yes. Could the Canaanites put their faith in God and be saved? Yes. Could the Egyptians put their faith in God and be saved? Yes. It has always been by faith for every single person, always by faith. That's Paul's whole argument in his letters. Romans, Galatians, he brings up in Ephesians. It's always been by faith. It is by faith. That is how people always have gotten saved. It's how they'll always get saved. Always been by faith. Okay. So this passage here, why does God want to kill Moses? And didn't he just call him? Burning bush, snake into staff, hand leprous, Nile or water to blood. Like, why is he now seeking to kill him? Okay, so let's look at the story a little bit and try to determine what is going on. So as good Bible students, we want to observe and to read the story well. So, verse 24 says, "At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint knife and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, 'Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me.' And so he let him alone. It was then that she said, 'A bridegroom of blood,' because of the circumcision." So what in the world is going on here? Well, that's the question pretty much everybody asks, no matter what your level of education is and how many times you've read this story. This is the response. But let me ask you, what is the main point of this story? When you look at the story, what is the main point? How do you find the main point of a story? The resolution. Right? What brings resolution to the story? Circumcision. Good. So the story is about circumcision. So whatever else is happening here, what the essence of the story is about is circumcision. Okay? Right? That's what solves the problem. Right? That's what Zipporah does. It's the conclusion and the explanation at the end, the bridegroom of blood, because of the circumcision. So whatever it is about, whatever's going on, why ever the Lord comes to kill him, the essence of the story is concerning circumcision. Okay, so that's the baseline for just our understanding of the story at the beginning. Okay, so then let's kind of walk through this a little bit. Because circumcision is quite an important thing for God. In fact, so important that once the Israelites cross the Jordan River, Joshua has all of the men of Israel circumcised in Joshua chapter 5. It seems like a moronic move, right? You don't move your army within striking distance of the enemy and then incapacitate them for more than a week, right? It's like idiocy, right? But it teaches an important principle. What we see here as well is that circumcision is important for the covenant, okay? For those who are going to represent God. Part of the covenant symbol here for the people is circumcision. Now, God seeking to kill Moses is probably not with a knife, right? It's not like he's coming to stab him. And Zipporah's like, we got to do this fast so he doesn't get him, right? Moses is probably sick. Okay, it probably is the interpretation of the event that the Lord has come to kill Moses because Moses is probably sick, which is why Moses is not the one performing the circumcision, and why Moses is touched because probably he does not have the personal ability or strength to do it himself. So the reason that Zipporah is the action character in the story probably leads us to believe the fact that Moses is in some way incapable of performing the action himself. So it's likely that this is a sickness of some kind that is making it seem like he is being killed or attacked, or the Lord is coming against him. So then, what we see with Zipporah is that so Moses took his wife and their sons. Okay, so they have 2 sons with them, plural, but Zipporah only circumcises one son. So it is possible that the other son was circumcised, or not, we're not really sure. But what it points to is that God is not going to allow for any compromise of the covenant among his leaders. Okay, that no matter what their status is, even Moses at the top of the ladder, is not going to be allowed to compromise the covenant, that everybody will equally have to follow the commands that God has given to them and the covenant that he has made with his people. So that's probably why he's circumcised. Why their son is circumcised. Now, what's the deal with this statement, the bridegroom of blood, and what does that mean? One of the challenges with dead languages is that you can't go to a library and pull out a dictionary for ancient Hebrew. Okay, you can't go to any kind of sources to pull out how did they use this word in a variety of different ways. But you can go to sister languages. Okay. So in the ancient world, especially the ancient Near East, a lot of the languages shared many similar words, and oftentimes they were written the same way, but they were used variously in different languages. So for Hebrew, one of the ways that we determine words that are used only once in the Old Testament, this word is not only used only once, but to help give some context, we go to other languages like Akkadian or Ancient Arabic or Ugaritic, and we say, how did they use this word in their context, and how can that help us to understand what it might mean? We'll see a couple of these in the book of Exodus that will help us. And in Akkadian, the word for circumcision can also mean protected. Okay, and so there could be carrying a double meaning here of protected. He's been protected, or protected by blood. So that idea could be what's going on. But regardless of it, what we do see is that the circumcision does withdraw the attack against Moses. And just like with the circumcision going into the promised land of all of the men in Israel, it joins the nation in with the covenant of their fathers to show the importance of stepping into the covenant, being part of this covenant people. So that's probably what is going on here, is partnership with the covenant, being in line with what God had called them to initially. But the next question is, what is Zipporah doing with her son's foreskin? Okay, because it's kind of weird that you would take that and then dabble it on his toes, as he's laying down. The one thing that's important to know with the Hebrew language is that there is no word for sex. And this is common in the ancient world because sex as a topic is incredibly taboo. Okay? And we know that because there is no word for it. So they only use euphemisms for it. Okay? So they use euphemisms to convey meaning for a subject that is unacceptable to talk about in normal conversation. So just some examples of this kind of action outside of the Bible. Crucifixion in the first century is something we talk about freely, and we use the word crucifixion quite freely. In the Roman world, nobody talked about crucifixion. It was always talked about euphemistically because it was such a horrendous punishment that nobody would talk about it at the dinner table or even in the marketplace. It was a conversation for people hidden away in the dark because of how horrendous it was. So they would refer to it as being lifted up, not being nailed to a cross, not being crucified. They would say you were lifted up. Or they would use phrases like the extreme punishment. And that meant being crucified. Okay? So other cultures do this kind of thing as well. So Hebrew for the idea of sex or things like that, they will use euphemisms. So Adam knew Eve, and she conceived and bore Abel. Right? That's how they use it, is they knew each other. Okay? So that's one of the ways that they use for sex. They will also use words like they laughed together. So when Rebecca and Isaac are laughing together and Pharaoh sees them, they're probably not telling each other jokes. Another one is that they played together. Okay, so if you read in Exodus that after they worshiped the golden calf, they sat down to feast and they rose up to play. Probably not volleyball. Right? So that's the kind of thing for the ancient Israelite world. So because of that, the whole act not having any kind of word for it, genitals are also referred to euphemistically. So sometimes they will be referred to as the thigh, because that's close to that area. And so you might have like Rehoboam saying that when people ask him for lighter workload, and Rehoboam responds by saying, "My pinky is thicker than my father's thigh." He's not talking about his legs. Or this instance with Moses. One of the ways that people referred to genitals was to refer to them as feet. Okay? So when Saul goes into the cave to use the bathroom, it says that he uncovered his feet and relieved himself, and that's when David cut off the corner of his robe. Well, he's not just uncovering his feet. He's probably taking off his clothes so he can use the bathroom. Okay. So when Moses then in this setting is having the foreskin touch his feet, it's probably not his toes. Okay. So all of that to just show you a number of examples. And the reason that is because probably Moses is incapacitated in some way. And if he is sick on the point of death, then his own circumcision, which we're unsure if he was circumcised or not, is that his own circumcision might have led to his death because of how sick he was, potentially. And so the idea of his son being circumcised and then that touching his feet could be an action of substitutionary circumcision in that moment. So that kind of ideas could be what's playing out here, just given the circumstances of what is happening. All right? So just to give you some more context for this, yeah, all that to be said, it's a very difficult passage, very hard, and that only sheds some light on it. So Moses returns to the people, and the awesome thing, right? He shows them all the signs, right? The snake turning, or the staff turning into a snake, the hand to leprosy, the water to blood. He shows them all the signs at the end of chapter 4, and they believe. But things change in chapter 5. So let's look at chapter 5 together. Would someone read chapter 5, verses 1 and 2 nice and loud for us?
Yeah. Afterwards, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold feasts to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go."
Okay, great. This passage is probably the most important passage for the next about 5 chapters. Okay. This one passage gives us the question that sets the tone for all of the signs that will come, for all the actions that will be done against Israel, for all the things that God will show himself powerful in through the signs. Okay. It comes from this one question or statement from Pharaoh. Who is the Lord? Okay. Now, so if you're Pharaoh, you're like, who is Yahweh? I've never heard of this guy. Like, This is really weird for him because there is good record in Egyptian chronology that slaves would regularly go on some kind of desert pilgrimage to worship their gods and then come back to serve as slaves. There's very good records of it. In fact, one of the examples might be them taking Jacob to go bury him in the Promised Land, right, at Machpelah. So that idea of Israel going out and then coming back could be one of these ideas, but it's otherwise very well known that slaves would go worship their gods in the wilderness at some desert shrine and then come back to Egypt to serve in Egypt. And so this is not a shocking request, but the shock is, who is this God that I have never heard of before? So Moses and Aaron speak to him. Pharaoh as himself is a god, presenting himself as a god, and so why should he submit to this new god that he has never heard of before? And that will set the tone. So what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh makes everything harder for the Israelites. Takes away the straw, makes making bricks incredibly difficult. And when we look at passages like chapter 5, verses 22 through 23, Moses is turning to the Lord and, why have you done this evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? Right? Pharaoh is just making things harder for the people, and you're not delivering them. As Moses, you would probably expect God to show up, right? You go to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh, you say, let my people go, and Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? And God, boom, right there, flash of lightning, I'm the Lord, right? That's what you'd expect, is God to just show up. But Moses goes to Pharaoh, and he does nothing. He makes life harder for the Israelites. And what happens with Moses here is that he begins to blame God. Why have you done this evil to this people? Right? You told me to come and deliver them, but you're not showing up. And it can be easy to blame God when we don't feel like he's doing what he's promised to do. And he begins to blame shift a little bit towards him. And so Moses and Aaron continue to speak on behalf of God, and God promises them deliverance, right? God promises the people that there will be some deliverance. And the crazy thing, I think, with all of this is that God is not showing up in it. You can imagine like being at the burning bush, this bush that's not being consumed, all these signs that God shows to you, your protection from the Lord on the way back, and then you go before Pharaoh and nothing happens. Like, where is God? Why isn't he showing up? All the Israelites hate us. Pharaoh is defaming your name, and nothing is happening, right? And what God affirms them in is that he will accomplish these tasks. Right? Chapter 6 is that God will come through. And so we see that with the first verse in chapter 6. But the Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. And so the repeated idea of this, what's called parallelism here, the same thing repeated twice or with similar language, is an affirmation of that thing happening. Okay, so God is affirming that that is going to happen. And then God speaks to them about his appearance before to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he appears to them by this name, God Almighty. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of God Almighty because I think it gives us some insight into the Israelite understanding of who God was and why they treat him the way they treat him later on. Because El Shaddai is the Hebrew word, that's the name, God Almighty, but the term Shaddai is hard to translate and we don't know what it means. The way that we translate it as Almighty comes from the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it comes from the book of Job, where the Greek Septuagint translators translated El Shaddai into Greek as God Almighty. Okay? So that's where we get our translation tradition from, is the Greek, not the Hebrew. So what does El Shaddai mean? Well, Shaddai is a little hard to determine what the exact meaning is, and it seems that it could come from the root of the word shad, which means breast. But having the name God of breasts doesn't really make sense very well. And it could be a picture of provision or a picture of sustenance, a picture of fertility in some way, but that doesn't seem to be the way that God presents himself throughout the scriptures. And to use language like that, when a lot of the other nations around them were incredibly sexualized in their worship, wouldn't really make sense. So there's an Akkadian word that is very relative to the word Shaddai or Shad, and it means mountain. Now, that's not a very large leap to make in a primitive language, that the same word for breast is the same word used for mountain. But to refer to God as the God of the mountains makes a lot more sense, given the fact that God appears to his people oftentimes at mountains. And so that idea very much is present, that God appears at Sinai. He appears at Mount Moriah with Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac. He appears at Mount Carmel with Elijah. The land of Israel that is conquered at the time of Joshua is all the mountainous regions of Israel. And so it seems like with Israel's idea of localized deities and their perspective of the ancient world where the God of certain regions has power over those regions, they kind of treat God as only powerful in the mountainous regions because of this idea of God revealing himself in that way, or being referred to as El Shaddai. And so, sorry? Akkadian, A-K-K-A-I, A-K-K-A-D-I-A-N. And it's a sister language to Hebrew. We get a lot of our understanding of Hebrew from Akkadian because of the shared language. And I think just in looking at this picture of Israel throughout their history and how they treated God, that it's likely that they treated him territorially and as a god of the mountains. It's interesting as well that a lot of the similar characteristics of Yahweh are seen in Baal, the god of Canaan, which may be why they worship Baal so easily when they go into Canaan, because of the similarities. Baal is a storm god who appears in thunder and lightning and clouds and sends rain on the earth for fertility. And Yahweh is a God who speaks through thunder and lightning, shows up in clouds, and appears on mountains. So there's some similarities, and Israel might have thought of Baal as another rendition or another localized name for their God. And so when God is very clear, you shall not worship the gods in the land. I am not the same as them. He is trying to change their cultural perspective that they would have been very, very ingrained with about deities, localized representation, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Question?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. So God Almighty is El Shaddai, God of the mountain.
So God Almighty is the translation from Greek. And then that has been read back into El Shaddai. So El is God, but Shaddai, it was hard to determine what that is. And so I think it probably relates to this idea of God of the mountains. Yeah. And so God God speaks to Moses and recounts these promises to them, but it doesn't really seem to enforce Moses that much or encourage him that much. The response of the people is not what you would expect it to be. They're kind of at a breaking point. He's confronted Pharaoh. He's not responding. All the Hebrew elders are like saying to Moses and Aaron, like, why have you done this? You've made our life harder, not better. And so Moses is feeling a little bit discouraged. And kind of what you would expect is that God would come to Moses and Aaron, put his arm around them and say, it's okay, we'll get them next time, right? But God doesn't do that, right? We expect God to be really comforting and encouraging in this moment, but at the end of, or in the middle of chapter 6, it says in verse 13, but the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them a charge about the people of Israel and about Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the people out of the land of Egypt. So that idea, that word charge, is the same idea as a command. Okay, so it's kind of like you can imagine like a sports game, like Moses and Aaron running off the field. They come to God, their coach, and they're like, they're killing us out there. Like, why are we not winning right now? And God kind of looks at them and says, all right, get back out on the field, and slaps them on the butt and sends them back out to play. Right? That's the picture here. Is like, get back out there. Right? We still got a job to do, and sometimes we need that. in our relationship with God, right? We always want to be comforted and encouraged and built up and feel good about ourselves. And sometimes we need God to come along, give us a good smack on the butt and say, get back out there, right? Stand up, buck up, right? And continue to be obedient. It's not always easy. And with Moses and Aaron, we see that. So the next section, chapter 7 here, we get the story of the confrontation of Pharaoh, which is really going to kick off the whole scenario of the signs. So the first sign that happens here, there's a confrontation, of course. Moses and Aaron come before Pharaoh. Would they feel any more confident coming before Pharaoh this time than they have the other times? When nothing has happened, no one's been showing up, or God hasn't been showing up. And in this time, they come in, and they throw down staff, right? So Aaron throws his staff down, and then the Egyptian magicians throw down their staffs, and they turn into snakes also. So do the Egyptian gods have the power to turn a piece of wood into a living snake? That is a question that many people can ask. Well, I doubt that they do, personally. I think it is probably God who changes the Egyptians' staffs into snakes for the sake of the scenario. And the reason I think that is because of what it teaches, right? The sign happening is not that the staff turns into a snake. That's not the sign. The sign is that the snake eats the other snakes. Okay? That's the sign that God is speaking or showing to the Israelites or to the Egyptians. Why? Why is the sign that the snakes eat, that the one snake eats the two snakes? Okay. The snake is a very important symbol for Egyptians at this time specifically. There were two patron deities of Egypt. Over Upper Egypt was the vulture, and over Lower Egypt was the snake. And if you guys remember from yesterday, Lower Egypt is northern Egypt. Lower Egypt is where Israel was at, the Nile River Delta in the north part of Egypt. That's where the most lush pasture lands were. That's where Israel lived. Right? That they were enslaved in this region, the portion of Lower Egypt. So the patron deity, which means the deity that guards and protects all of this land, was a snake. Okay? And that's why you see on the headdress of pharaohs, the vulture and the snake together on their crown, is because the Pharaoh is saying that he's a representative of all of the land of Egypt, both Lower and Upper Egypt. Okay? So he is the vulture and the snake. So when the snake gets thrown, the staff gets thrown down, turns into a snake, and then it eats the other two snakes, it's showing God's sovereignty and supremacy over the God of this region. That God is more powerful, and he's going to show himself more powerful. And so this is a direct attack on Pharaoh's authority as the one who represents the god Wadjet, who's Wadjet. I think it's on the slide here. It is not. So, Wadjet is that, the patron deity, Wadjet. And it shows God's dominance and superiority over the god of this area of Egypt. The other point being the fact that a rod or a staff was seen as the delegation of authority. So any ruler who had some kind of staff or rod, that was seen as one of their signs of their authority, and they would use that in judgmental decisions or in exacting of punishment on people. And so for Moses and Aaron to carry the staff of God shows them as God's direct representatives for God to Pharaoh. And so they're showing God more powerful. So this is all an answer to that question of chapter 5. We'll refer back to this many times. But all of this is a response. Who is the Lord? Chapter 5, verse 2. Who is the Lord? Well, you're going to find out who the Lord is. So turning the Nile into blood is not the first sign. The first sign is the snakes, and that God shows himself sovereign over the patron deity of Egypt. So the question really is going to be, over and over and over, is who is more powerful? Who is more powerful? Right? You're going to see this laid out in the fact that Pharaoh has to beg Moses to get the plagues taken away. Pharaoh thinks he's all powerful. He thinks he's supreme. He thinks he's all that in a bag of chips. And then he has to go begging to Moses to get things taken away. Okay, so that's really the play here, is who is more powerful. All right, any questions over the past couple of chapters? We're getting into... Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's just a metaphor, probably, for him feeling incapable of speaking well. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yes. Yeah, what's the connection between circumcision and being able to speak well? That probably idea is his feeling of incapability. The idea of I don't want to get like incredibly graphic, but the idea of like circumcision, they refer to as someone who has a hard heart as being uncircumcised. And so it seems the idea of something that's closed or protected, or the inability to like reveal. And so with speaking as well, having uncircumcised lips is that idea of maybe like this closed off or inability to communicate well, something that is not open. So does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Let's take a break. Take 10 minutes, and then we'll start back at about 10:47 or so. So let's continue through chapter 7. We'll get through, I think, a majority, if not all, of these signs or plagues in the next few chapters. But any questions? I think Joseph, you had a question at break. Okay. Okay. Yes. Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? The ultimate question. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Sorry, you'll have to wait one more day. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So let's talk about these signs then. What happens with the signs? So we've got the first sign. So they snakes eat the other snakes, and that is the first sign against Pharaoh and against his authority and against his power. And then the second sign is going to be the Nile turning into blood, or turning to blood. Okay, so the Nile River, one thing that's important to understand is that even to this day, the nation of Egypt is dependent upon the Nile River as its source of life. Okay, and the Nile River used to be much bigger than it is right now, and you're going to see it today. It's huge, right? It's a very large river, but it used to be much bigger until it got dammed up the Nile River and was regulated on its flow. It used to come and flood the regions around the Nile. But if you look at like Google Maps, like Joseph and I were looking at Google Maps yesterday, if you zoom out, the Nile River looks really, really big. But it's actually very small, but because of the greenery around the Nile, it looks really large because all the area around the Nile is fertile. That's where they grow their crops. It's the lush land, and everything around the water sources in Egypt is actually very fertile. And so the Nile River really is what facilitated the life of Egypt. All of the trade routes up and down the country were sourced through the Nile River, and it facilitated cultural advances. Papyrus was invented or initially created in Egypt from the papyrus plant along the Nile River. And so the earliest form of paper came from Egypt because of the Nile River's papyrus that was growing alongside of it, which facilitated advances in math and religion, culture, philosophy, all these types of things. The mud that was created from the Nile River is what is used to make bricks. They would not have been able to make mud bricks without the water from the Nile River. And so it facilitated all of their cultural growth as far as cities and construction goes, and for the Israelites to be able to make those bricks. Their crops grew along the Nile, and so for them it was everything. It was everything. And so a judgment against the Nile River to begin this whole scenario is an incredible hit for the country. This is not just some water turning into blood. Right? This is your only source of water, right? And it is being made blood. Now, this leads to things like the wildlife in the river dying, right? The fish dying, leading to the stench all throughout the land. Probably the frogs coming out of the Nile are being driven out of the Nile River because they can no longer breathe in the water. And the people end up digging for water. It says the Egyptians were digging for water, and probably that's because they're looking for some way to filter it through the rocks. Right? So they're digging for water near the Nile River to hopefully try to filter the water through rocks. What each of these plagues is going to do is going to execute judgment against the gods of Egypt. Okay, so again, this goes back to chapter 5, verse 2. Who is the Lord? Right? Yahweh is going to show who he is by showing himself more powerful than every other god, or all of the important gods of Egypt. So, each one of these, God is saying, your God of the Nile cannot control the waters. He is not powerful enough to protect you. Yahweh is powerful enough to show judgment over them. Okay, so the verse that helps us understand all of this is chapter 5, verse 2, and also chapter 12, verse 2. Where God will say that these signs are in judgment of the gods of Egypt. Okay, specifically, the sign there is the death of the firstborn son, which we'll look at. But it's all for the purpose of judgment against the gods of Egypt. Sorry, not 12:2. There's the verse I'm looking for. 12:12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and all the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. Okay. So that's our kind of point here, is that each one of these plagues are against various gods of Egypt. Now, it's not to say that every god of Egypt is being judged through each one of these, but the final plague is, or the final sign is, a judgment against all of the gods. We'll see why. So, specifically this one, the Nile River is against Hapi, who is the god who controls the flow and flood of the river, the Nile River, and the goddess Hatmet, who is the goddess of fish for them. So all the fish dying, one of the sources of life and food for them is dying. One of the phenomena about the Nile River is that periodically throughout its history that a red algae will grow on the river, and when that red algae grows on the river, it is a symbol of a bad omen of worse things to come. And so the whole idea of the Nile turning red is thought to then predict or prelude all that is going to come after this moment in time. And sometimes people have connected the initial signs together to show how they build off of one another. And so, for example, you have the Nile turning to blood, which would lead to all the frogs being driven out of the Nile River because they cannot breathe in the water. And then you have the gnats, which may be mosquitoes. And after all the water has been gathered for the people to continue to have some source of water after the Nile River has become undrinkable, then all that standing water is perfect breeding ground for all of the mosquitoes. And these kind of things seem to be able to play off of each other potentially. All the frogs die, and when the frogs die, that leads to maggots, and that leads to flies. And the flies that come after that then lead to the death of the livestock. And so these potentially build off each other, and we'll see maybe how they connect. But each one of these things is showing judgment and God's judgment against the people. So what is the point of the judgment on the Nile? That God is in control of all of the water. Now, one more thing about water in the Old Testament is that water for the Hebrew people, for the Israelites all throughout their history, is a symbol of chaos. And every creation story of the ancient world has to do with some sort of chaotic water and source of life or creation emerging from or being created from the waters of chaos. And this is no different for the Israelites. When you open up Genesis chapter 1, and it says the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and then God brings the land out of the waters, he is bringing his organized creation out of chaos. And they view the waters as that, uncontrollable. So for God to assert his power over the Nile River and then over the Red Sea when he parts the Red Sea shows his ultimate sovereignty over all of creation and even the most chaotic things in creation. Now, the irony with the magicians in these initial stories is that they are able to reproduce the plague. Okay, so they turn the Nile or turn the water into blood. But it's ironic because of the fact that they're actually making things worse. They can't actually do anything to help their own people. Okay, they're like, yeah, we can do that too. We'll make it just as bad. Okay, and then when they get the frogs to come, the water turns into blood, the snake, it just makes everything worse. It doesn't help them at all. Okay? So they're able to imitate, but they're not able to create. With the next sign, the sign of the frogs that come out of the water, probably, because of the bloody Nile, it's said that the frogs in the rainy season are so deafening with their croaking that they sound like herds of cattle. And even still in parts of Egypt, in the rainy season, when the frogs come out of the Nile River, because the other land is lush and wet, then their croaking would be like herds of cattle coming out. So the goddess of the frogs is Heket, and is a symbol of fertility. So frogs, for the people of Egypt at the time, was a symbol of life, and demonstrated and carried with it a life-giving idea, fertility in pregnancy, but also just life in general. And the Egyptians would not kill frogs. Okay? They would pick them up and throw them out, or take them back to the river, or get them out of their house or wherever, but they would not kill frogs. And at various times throughout Egypt's history, killing a frog would have led to the person's capital punishment. Okay? So that means that you could be killed for killing a frog at various times in Egyptian history. And so they won't kill frogs, which is why they're in their food bowls, in their beds, in their drinking cups, in all of their vessels. They're finding frogs, and they're not doing anything about it because of the fact that they are a symbol of fertility and life, and they have a high respect for them. So that's why Pharaoh, he's going to come to them and say, come out and lead these frogs away, or get rid of these frogs. But now this symbol of life will become a symbol of death for them. So instead of not trying to step on frogs and even involuntarily killing one, then now they'll be everywhere for them. So after Pharaoh comes to Moses to get the frogs to go away, Moses does, and this leads to all of the frogs' death. Okay, so all the frogs die, and what once was a symbol of life for the Egyptians now becomes heaping, stinking piles of death. And that is just, again, a demonstration of God's power over these Egyptian gods, that he is answering this question of who is the Lord. Okay. The next sign, the sign of the gnats, the word gnat just means swarming things. And so this could also be considered to be potentially mosquitoes or something like that. But what Moses does, he takes a staff and he hits the earth. And so the dust rises up, and that's what then is seen to be the gnats that come, or the mosquitoes that come to the people. And this is against Geb, and Geb was the god of earth. He was the one who Ra had laid out as the land for all to be built off of. So it shows God's power over all of the earth, the dust of the earth, the bounty of the soil, and all that which comes alongside of that. Now, with the frogs and with the Nile turning to blood, the priests of all of the temples could still go before their gods and seek them to deliver them. They could intercede to their gods and ask them to deliver them, to free them from these plagues. But with the gnats and the or the bites they would receive, or the gnats being on their skin, they could not go in before their gods because they were considered unclean. So priests in the Egyptian culture, they would shave their heads, they would ceremonially wash, and they would come before the gods incredibly purified as well as they possibly could to be received by their gods. So to not be able to come before the gods because of the insects that are covering over them would hold them back from actually asking for deliverance from them. And then from this sign, the magicians are not able to reproduce these signs towards showing the power of the gods. So if all the water that was gathered as the Nile River had turned to blood and they're getting other water than the Nile, sourced from the Nile, that produced potentially standing water for the gnats or mosquitoes to breed in, then all of the dead frogs may have produced the next one, the flies that come. And so the flies, we know that their larvae feed off of rotting flesh or rotting vegetation. And so for these giant piles of frogs that are now rotting and stinking in the desert sun, it is possible that the flies have come from them. So what God is showing to the people, right, is that he is not localized to Canaan. Okay, Yahweh is not just in the land of Canaan, but he is also powerful over the land of Egypt. In 822, during the plague of the flies, it will be said that, "But on that day, I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarm of flies shall be there. But you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth." Okay. The word earth there is just the same word as the word land. And a lot of times, earth and land are really translated based off context. So if we get this idea then that God is separating the land of Goshen from the land of the Egyptians, what he's showing is that I am powerful over your land. Not just powerful over the whole earth, but over this land right here. And so he's making a division, separating the two from one another to show his supremacy. Now, the ancient kind of cosmological view of the world is that the world was flat. Okay? The Bible, the Old Testament, and even the New Testament will view the world as flat, does not view the world as spherical, because of the ancient perspective. That's how they thought of the earth. They didn't think of it as a sphere or a globe. They thought of it as usually a plate, round, circular plate. And when it talks about the waters above being separated from the waters below in creation, it's an ancient cosmological worldview that above is this dome that is holding back the waters that are above, which is why the sky is blue. And when it rains, it's the waters breaking through, right, that come down from the sky in this dome. The stars in the sky and the planets that they see, which look like stars in the sky, are the gods and the spiritual beings that you see up in the heavens. Okay, this is their ancient cosmological worldview. You'll see this with some sarcophagus in the Egyptian museum that have the goddess Nut on it, and she's overstretched as the goddess of the sky and all the stars over her. And so that kind of worldview is what they had. So you have the land, and you have this dome and all the gods outside of that. And below the land are all these pillars that hold up the land, and then water below those pillars as well. So that's kind of their perspective, their ancient perspective of the world. So God saying that he's controlling all the earth doesn't always necessarily make sense as when he's talking about the land in the context. So it's likely here he's just demonstrating his power over the land that is the Egyptian land, where they think their gods have power. And so God is trying to dismantle this territorial mindset of deities. And a lot of what he's doing is dismantling or destroying cultural mindsets of the day. So who is this plague against, or this sign against? Well, there is a god named Uachit, the god of the flies. And he was the one who was worshipped in honor of this insect. But the word fly doesn't really tell us a lot about the insect. In the Septuagint translation, which is, again, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it was translated in Alexandria, which is just a number of hours from here up on the north coast of Egypt. And the translators of the Septuagint translated it in Egypt, and they don't translate it just as fly. They translate the word as a gadfly. And the gadfly is a blood-sucking fly that usually sucks the blood of animals. And so they're very commonly known as a stable fly. And the Greek translation tells us that, and probably it's very likely, because having been translated in Egypt, they're probably referring to the fly that they're familiar with. So the gadfly could have led to the death of the livestock, as they suck the blood of animals, and as you have tons of these flies, they're passing on disease, and that disease leads to the death of the livestock. Now, does all of the plagues connecting to each other show the power of nature or the power of God? Okay. And this is something that we have got to understand about the Hebrew perspective of God's sovereignty. And that is that there is no difference. Right? God set the world in motion. And so the things that happen upon the earth are God doing those things. And the natural repercussions can be seen as God doing those things. Okay, so there is no disconnect between each of these actions. Now, what we do see specifically is God's sovereignty on dividing the land. Okay, we see that certain things happen in certain places or only to certain people. And so God's sovereign control over where things happen and who they happen to shows and demonstrates his power. So regardless of the flow of the signs, we see God's sovereignty over each one of these things as they come, that he is in control of them. All right. So with probably all of these flies then passing on plagues to the animals or to sickness to the animals, it leads to this wide death of the livestock. So the fifth sign in chapter 9, see this plague coming against all the livestock of the Egyptians, but not of the Israelites. So in Egyptian culture, pretty much every single animal is deified in some way. I mentioned yesterday that there are mummies found of all sorts of different animals. And so every animal is deified, every animal is worshipped in some capacity. And so this death of the livestock of the Egyptians is probably seen to be against all of the gods of various animals of the Egyptians. One of the most famous Egyptian animal cults is the Apis bull cult, where the primary temple is found in Memphis, a city south along the river from here. And it worshipped the bull god Ptah. Ptah was seen as the creator of the universe by those living in Memphis. And at the city of Memphis, they believed that a lightning strike would come down and strike a cow, and that cow would become the Apis cow. And he would be the one that would be worshipped and honored. It would be groomed and taken care of and fed better meals than any human living in the poorer society. Right? It was treated essentially like a king at the temple. And then once the bull got too old and it died, then they would mummify the bull and they would bury it in its own personal burial chamber. And at the temple of Apis in Memphis, they have found 64 separate burial chambers for cows. And so these bulls give us a documented time of hundreds of years where the bulls are worshipped. When you think of a cow that they are worshiping, the cows are going to live for decades at a time. Okay, so to have 64 of them gives us just a simple documentation of hundreds of years, centuries, where they were worshiping this bull and then mummifying them. And a bull mummy is very large. It's really a big mummy. But yeah, so they're worshiping all of these animals. So the judgment of God against the Egyptians here, of course, is against all of their various gods of their livestock. But also what this begins to do is it begins to show God's power against Pharaoh to protect his people and to preserve their food stock. Okay? So what God is going to begin to do, the other plagues are really just nuisances. Nile to blood, mosquitoes or gnats, flies, frogs, all of those things are nuisances to the people. With the beginning of the livestock and then the hail, the destruction is going to come upon the people's sustenance, okay? Their ability to provide for themselves food-wise. So after the death of the livestock is the plague of the boils in the sixth sign in chapter 9. And the plague of the boils is would have been like these blisters. I don't know if you guys know boils. They're like a blister that breaks open, and so they're all open sores on people's bodies. Now, where do these come from? How do they come? The instructions from God for Moses is to take some of the soot from the kilns and to throw it in the air, and it will become boils upon the people. Okay. So, what are these kilns? The kilns are probably the place where the Israelites are baking the bricks that they're making. Okay. So, when they're making bricks to build buildings, they're not just laying them out in the sun and letting the sun dry them, they're baking them. Okay, so they take them to these very large kilns, they're baking the bricks to harden them to be used as building bricks for the Egyptians. So what then is happening is the sign of Israel's suffering as slaves is now becoming the suffering of the Egyptians. Okay, which is why Moses is told to take the soot from the kiln, or the ash from the kiln, and throw it into the air. Now, this soot is probably, it's not black, but white, like ash, right? Ash is white. So some people have thought that the similarity then between the dead animals and then the kiln probably leads to the boils on people's skin. So a lot of rotting animals without any kind of consumption or burial or disposal, just a bunch of dead animals rotting, would produce a large amount of this powdery substance called cutaneous anthrax. What some people consider is that the dead animals then producing this basically a deadly powder from their rotting flesh leads to the boils on people's skin. So that's one consideration just of how those plagues might be linked together. And so this would again prevent the priests from going in before their gods, of being able to pray for their deliverance, and would have been another nuisance upon people's skin. So boils don't lead to people's death, but they are incredibly inconvenient. And this plague would be against the god Imhotep, the god of healing. And so as we come to the seventh sign, we're going to see much more very supernatural things happening in 7, 8, 9, and 10. The plague of the hail, the plague of locusts, darkness, and then the death of the firstborn. So the seventh sign, the sign of the hail, helps us understand a lot of what is going on. And so this portion of chapter 9 is incredibly important for us. So the sign of the hail is against Nut, the goddess of the sky, as she's not able to protect them. But it also could be against Shu, the god of wind, and the crop gods, Isis and Seth, because it is attacking the flax and destroying some of the crops of the Egyptians. But one of the key things that we get in this passage is God's purpose. Okay, so oftentimes people wonder, why is God doing this? Well, we laid this out in chapter 5, but it becomes very clear in chapter 9 of why God is doing what he is doing. And this gives us an incredible apologetic for the plagues or the signs, because God is very, very clear. So would someone read chapter 9, verses 15 through 17 for us?
For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you with the Hebrew pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. For this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You are 17?
Yep.
You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go.
Okay. So why is God doing this? so that he will be known. Right? It's so that he will be known on the earth. Okay? He's not doing it to kill them. Right? He says, if I wanted to, I could have done that. I could have extended my hand and struck you. But that's not the goal. The goal is not to kill you. The goal is that people would know me. And that's exactly what happens. That decades from now, when they go into the Promised Land, the Canaanites remember what happened to the Egyptians. They know what God did. So these signs, God is doing this intentionally to show who he is to the people. And ultimately, to demonstrate his power over the other gods. Right? That none of them are more powerful than he is. And also to destroy in their minds this idea that he is only powerful in one region, in one location. Right? And that their gods are somehow more powerful in Egypt or have more authority there. And against Pharaoh, of course, right? We're going to see that with the 10th plague in chapter 12. It's specifically against Pharaoh, who thinks he's God, who thinks he can protect people. And so chapter 9 helps us a lot to know the response. And what we see, really, I think amazingly, in verse 20, it says, Then whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into the house. Okay. Now, that's astounding, right? Because while Pharaoh is rejecting God over and over and over, and he's turning his heart away from the word of Moses, that there are servants in Pharaoh's house who are recognizing the Lord and beginning to fear him. Okay? So, what do we see? That God's desire in 15 through 17 is being fulfilled in 9:20. People who are not Israelites are coming to recognize who God is and to honor him as God, which I think is an amazing response.
Why would we have livestock?
So, yeah. So this is one of the questions: is at what length of time are these things taking place? Okay, are these all taking place in 1 week, or in 10 days, or is it taking place over months? And are the signs of things against the complete eradication of those things, or is it just plagues upon the people? So you think of like a pandemic or a plague. You know, we've been kind of going through one now. Not everybody's affected, but not everybody's suffering from it. Similar kind of thought with the plagues potentially is that while it is a inconvenience or a suffering to a majority of the population, not everybody might have suffered from it. Or if they still have livestock, it might have been that all of the Egyptian livestock had been killed, and they're upset with the Israelites for not having their livestock killed, and they go and take some of their livestock. That's one option as well. So, with this chapter then, there's this hailstorm that comes, and as the hailstorm comes, it talks about it with fire raining from heaven. Okay, so verse 23, Moses stretched out his staff towards heaven, and the Lord sent thunder, hail, and fire rain down from heaven. Okay. Is God sending bolts of fire or like pillars of fire down from heaven upon the Egyptians? Probably not. Okay. The word fire is the same word that we would translate as lightning. Okay. So imagine you live 4,000 years ago. There's never been a light bulb. There's never been a power line. Okay? You don't know what electricity is. And every time a blue flashing thing comes down from the sky, it lights something on fire. Okay? So lightning is not associated with electricity. Lightning is associated with fire. Because every time lightning strikes, it starts a fire. So bolts of fire are probably lightning bolts. Baal, the storm god, like Yahweh, is associated with throwing fire from the sky. And when we see those depictions, it's always lightning bolts. Okay, so that idea is probably lightning associated with the thunder, not a special kind of fire coming down from the sky. So when Elijah is at Mount Carmel, and it says that he dumped all this water on the sacrifice, and then the fire of God came down and licked up all of the water and the sacrifice, it's probably not a tube of fire coming down and consuming all the water. It's probably lightning. And when Nadab and Abihu are offering wrong incense at the tabernacle, and it says the fire of God came out and consumed them, and then Aaron and his sons have to carry the bodies away from the tabernacle. Their bodies are still there because they probably got struck by lightning. It's not like they got consumed and just burned up by fire. Okay, so this kind of idea throughout the Old Testament, and why then God becomes associated with smiting people with lightning. You guys are wondering, God going to strike me with lightning? It comes from this idea, is that God is a God of lightning, and that is where the fire idea comes from. So the word as well for thunder here is literally the voice of God. Okay, so the ancient perspective of like thunder, lightning storms was that the gods were angry and they were speaking judgment against the people, or they were storming up in heaven. I mean, you can think, if your worldview is that there's this dome across the sky, and every time these storm clouds come, there's all this thunder that's happening. It sounds like the gods yelling down at them or stomping on this dome, and because of their anger. So the thunder then against the people is literally the voices of God, or the voice of God. And so that's his speaking in judgment against the people. This same voice of God will come at Mount Sinai when he shows up in thunder and in lightning at the mountain. But on this topic of what is the time frame for these plagues, we should take some note on that, because what we see in the end of this plague in chapter 9, verses 31 and 32, we get this parenthetical statement. It's a statement in parentheses, and it says, "The flax and the barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud, but the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they were late in coming up." This is a very important note because it tells us when the plagues are taking place. Okay? So, flax and barley come up early, and wheat is still in the ground. And so the reason the wheat doesn't get struck down by the hail is because it's still underground. It hasn't popped up yet to grow yet. So one of the reasons that Pharaoh probably does not relent, at this plague, is because he still has food. He still has resources available to him to continue living. So there's food still available. The wheat will still come, and so they still have food. The flax and the barley, the flax specifically is just an economical crop. Flax is used to make linen, and it's not eaten. Okay, so we eat flax seed today, but flax in the ancient world was not primarily a food source; it was a clothing source. Okay, so Pharaoh is not really suffering from this because it's only an economical hit. But the flax and the barley come up around January. Okay, so they come out of the ground and begin to really grow swiftly beginning in January. And so it's likely that this plague or this action takes place in January, the hail. Okay? So that gives us one marking point. Well, we know then that the death of the firstborn son takes place in late March or early April. How do we know that? Because the Passover feast is always celebrated in the springtime. Okay? And that is the institution of the Passover. So, plague number 7 and plague number 10 are separated from each other by roughly about a 2 to 3 month period. So it's not like these things are happening back to back to back. If the wheat was already if this was February, the wheat would already beginning to spring up and would have been destroyed. Okay? As well, chapter 7, where the Nile begins to flood and the frogs come out of the Nile River and invade the land and all these mosquitoes, that probably happens in October, because the rainy seasons around September bring the flooding Nile in October, and that is when the Nile would have then devastated the land, probably, and turning to blood, in the time when it's supposed to be the most fertile and the biggest blessing to the crops of the Egyptians would be seen as the time of the greatest judgment upon their life source. So it's likely that these plagues probably started in October and lasted for about 6 months until the springtime. Which, when you read this, it seems like Pharaoh hardening his heart happens all in 1 week. You're like, okay, dude, like you're suffering in like 7 days. Why do you keep hardening your heart so much? But if it's happening over a 6-month period, and each plague is separated from each other by a few weeks or by even a couple months, then it makes more sense of why Pharaoh is coming to this conclusion of, okay, I'm just going to hold out. And he keeps denying them, and he keeps refusing to let the people go. All right. Any questions on anything so far? We need to take a drink of water. Yeah.
So when it says like throughout all the land of Egypt, what, like, how big of a territory is it? How many?
Yeah. Yeah. So how big of a territory is all this taking place, and how many people is this affecting? Ancient population accounts, or ancient population records are really unknown. We don't know how many people really live in most places, and a lot of times numbers are exaggerated for the glory of their gods, which we'll talk about in chapter 12. But so we're not really sure exactly how many people. It's probably not millions, because there probably aren't millions of people. It's probably tens of thousands of people who are affected, and most of this is probably happening near or around the Nile River. Because in the ancient world, you don't live in the desert because there's no water. You can't live where there's no water. Water is one of the main gathering points of any ancient civilization. And so for the Egyptians, all of their happenings take place around the Nile River. So their population, their life, and Egyptians as well in the ancient world would not go on like military campaigns throughout the world very far. One thing you notice is that Egypt never conquers other lands. They always attack and bring slaves or resources and wealth back to Egypt. And that's because they believed if you didn't die near the Nile River, you weren't buried near the Nile River, then you would be sentenced to no afterlife. That you would not be able to go get your heart weighed and have a future in the afterlife. So most of it's happening around the Nile, all that to be said. Most of it's happening around the Nile River, affecting tens to hundreds of thousands of people. We're really unsure on it. Yeah, it's the best I can do for you.
Would there be people experiencing the plagues that wouldn't know that Moses is approaching Pharaoh? Like, was that like a widespread thing? Like, everyone knew that Moses is
Yeah.
talking to Pharaoh? Or was it kind of like what's happening live?
Yeah. So, question: Do the Egyptians realize why they are suffering from the plagues, and does everybody know that it's because of Moses? Probably not. Yeah, simply probably not. Just given the nature of the situation, it's unlikely that every single person would know why the things are happening. But as I think things continue to happen over this period of time, and these devastating moments in their land that take place probably would have led to their later understanding, which is why at the beginning you don't see a lot of response, but by chapter 7 or chapter 9, people are responding. They're like, okay, we have got to listen to Moses, and they actually begin to do it. And then in chapter 12 it says that a mixed group or a rabble came out with them, with the Israelites. So clearly there are people who trust in who Yahweh is, and they follow him and his people out of Egypt. So I do think you see later on more people knowing and understanding and then following. Yeah. So could this have affirmed Moses as the author? Potentially. I mean, you could think implicationally it might be. But I don't know if it would have been like directly affirming of it. So, yeah, you could speculate in that direction. Great. All right. So let's maybe cover the locust plague here, and then we'll wrap up. So locusts in the ancient world are very much a danger to any village in this region of the world. Nobody who has experienced locusts will doubt the account of the book of Exodus. that they are devastating wherever they go. And the only reason that we don't hear about locust plagues in the past 100 years is because the United Nations has regulated the spraying of pesticides against locusts all throughout Africa for the past about 75 years. And so, a lot of the migratory locusts are sprayed to be killed now in Africa. And the reason we don't suffer from locust plague anymore is because of that. But the plague here, the sign here, is against all of the crop gods. Any god of the crops, because what the locusts are going to come do is they're going to come and they're going to eat all of the food and all of the vegetation. Okay. And it said that after locusts eat all of the available food to them, then they begin to eat all of the leaves off the trees and all of the leaves off of the vines. And after that, they begin to simply peel the bark off of trees. And their jaws, the pincers on them, are so strong that they can snap twigs with their pincers. Right? So it's not just like, I'm going to eat a soft little leaf. It's like, these are devastating insects. Okay? And they destroy whatever they come across. In fact, in ancient times, a plague of locusts, a small plague of locusts, 1 square mile, can number as many as 100 to 200 million locusts in a 1 square mile area. And locust plagues that are enormous are estimated in the trillions of insects. And they don't just live and die, but as they go along, they continue to produce larvae. Okay? So if they're not driven into the sea, or they're not driven into a place with no vegetation, they will continue to persist for years at a time. And a 1 square mile locust swarm can consume the entire village food supply in a matter of minutes. Okay, so these things are not just like, oh, they're bugs, you know? Like, this is devastation. This is the only, or the first plague that truly threatens the survival of the Egyptians. So I want to read you one story here that illustrates this point very well. No one who's ever seen locusts at work accuses the Bible account of hyperbole. In 1926 and 1927, small swarms of African migratory locusts were spotted in an area 50 miles by 120 miles. Okay, so I just told you 100 to 200 million locusts in a 1 square mile area. Okay, so 50 by 100 miles. Okay, it is an enormous area. And they were spotted on the plains of the river Niger near Timbuktu, which is closer to West Africa. Okay. The next year, swarms invaded Senegal and Sierra Leone, which are 2 West African countries. And by 1930, this is 3.5 to 4 years later, the whole of West Africa was flailing away at the pests with everything movable. Brooms, branches, the whole of West Africa. But the locusts didn't seem to notice, and swarms reached Khartoum, nearly 2,000 miles to the east of West Africa. So that's halfway across the continent. Then they turned south across Ethiopia, Kenya, the Belgian Congo, and in 1932, they struck the lush farmland of Angola and Rhodesia before the plague finally sputtered out 14 years after it began. And it affected 5 million miles of Africa, and it was an area nearly double the size of the United States. 1 plague of locusts, 14 years. So, thinking about this plague in Egypt, it is not something that's unknown to the ancient world. And all throughout the Old Testament, we'll talk about the plagues of locusts that will come. In fact, it's a judgment given in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28 about the people's disobedience. If they are disobedient to God, then He will send locusts upon the land. And so this plague would have been absolutely devastating and would have shown clearly the ultimate power of God over all of the gods of Egypt, over Pharaoh. And that's why Pharaoh has to come to him to plead for God to take it away. Right? He's beginning to be humbled himself, but will not allow the people to go. Right? And you can see how broken Pharaoh is in the seventh plague, because at this sign he says to Moses and Aaron, I will let the men go. Like I'll try to meet you in some place like where you're at. Like I will let some people go. Right? Because he's so broken over the devastation that has come. But because he's not going to let everybody go, he will not, Moses will not receive it. Okay, so Pharaoh still tries to hold on to some of his power. You see this in chapter 10, verses 10 and 11. Right? He still tries to hold on to some of it, and it won't let them go. Okay. All right. I think we're in a good place to kind of stop for today and begin to break for lunch. So, are there any other questions people have? Anything from the first 9 or half chapters or so? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, with the Egyptians starting to recognize Yahweh, would they have wanted to come with the come with the Israelites, or would they have begun to change their philosophy or their belief system? The answer is yes. We do see that some people do come out with them. In chapter 12, there's like a mixed rabble that comes out with Israel. And also, kind of what I had brought up yesterday in the background is that what you notice is not in the time of Thutmose III's son, but his grandson. The kingdom begins to move more towards a henotheistic philosophy or religious system where they are exalting one deity above the rest. And so there is some kind of recognition there is a God who is more powerful than the other gods, and we should worship him and give him honor. So, yeah. You do see the repercussions. Yeah.
I'm just a little confused in chapter 10, like when Pharaoh says, like, let the men go, and then Moses and Aaron are going to go, and then it's like this big, like, I'm just, why, or what makes Pharaoh change his mind, or, like, what does he mean exactly?
Yeah, so Pharaoh's in that paragraph, so yeah, he says, go serve the Lord your God. Which ones are you to take? This is chapter 10, verse 8. And then verse 9, Moses said, we're going to go with everybody, the old and the young, right? Which means every single person, our sons and our daughters. And he said, I will not let you go. Like, I'll only allow the men to go among them. Okay, so Pharaoh is saying, Moses is like, we want everybody to come with us. And Pharaoh's like, you can only take the men. Because Pharaoh's not opposed to them going and worshiping their God and coming back. Right? That was very well known in their culture, in the Egyptian culture with slaves, is that they would go out, they worship their God, some shrine, and then they would come back and they would serve again. And the reason that Pharaoh says you can't take everybody is because I've got to hold on to something as hostage. Right? So if all the men leave, well, they're not just going to leave everybody else. Their families, their livestock, their wealth, they're going to come back. And so he says, sure, you can take all the men. I have no idea who this Yahweh is except for what I have seen by these signs. And so go ahead, take all the men, and you can go wherever you want, but come back. And Moses is like, nah, we're not going to do it. So it's not until everybody can come that we'll go.
So, like, Moses wasn't
Yes. Yeah, they wouldn't come back. Yeah.
He was trying to make sure believe that, oh, let's go, and then we'll be back.
That's.
Or was he saying,
I think he's playing off of Pharaoh's assumption that they would come back. And that's why he's saying, no, we're not going to go until everybody can come with us. It's not let us go and never come back kind of thing. I think he's playing off of Pharaoh's assumption that, well, they'll probably come back. So when they all go, Pharaoh realizes the mistake he's made, and that's why he goes after them.
so, like, I understand, like, oh, God's doing all these big things, obviously you would let them go now. But wouldn't it actually make, like, the situation worse for Pharaoh, because now he doesn't have any livestock, he doesn't have any, like, crops, so
I think he would let the men go because they would come back. So he's not letting the men go to never come back. He's letting them go so that they can go worship and then return, because they have something to return for. And so, if Pharaoh's like devastated at this time, why is he like upset about letting the people go? Because he loses a huge slave labor force, and to go and to restock that slave labor force means the cost of Egyptian lives as he goes to fight battles, to gather slaves, and to replenish it. So I think that that's probably why he goes back after them later on. Yeah. Okay. Great. There's no other questions, and I'll pray for us, and we can be done. Lord, thank you so much for this book and this time. Lord, thank you for the great weather, Lord, here, and thank you for the breeze that blows through this courtyard, Lord. Thank you, Jesus, for just the profound and important truths in this book, or the way that you have revealed yourself, God, the way that you've shown yourself powerful and almighty and sovereign, Lord, and that as we look at you, God, that we can stand in awe of how amazing you are. Lord, would you help us to know you better through this book, God, and I pray that our hearts would be humbled as we read it, Jesus, that as we discover you and see you, Lord, for who you are and how you've revealed yourself, that truly we would be moved, Lord, and that our hearts and our lives would reflect who you are, God. Thank you so much, Lord, for just the amazing ways that you've shown yourself in this book. Jesus, I pray you bless this class as they study, God, as they dive into this book. Would you open it up to them? Lord, I pray that you'd bring transformation through this book in areas they weren't even expecting, Lord, as they discover who you are. In Jesus' name, amen.